Early. Let's welcome in Patrick Gadson. He's Vincent and Elkins' partner and co-chair of Shareholder Activism. He's an attorney who advises companies like Salesforce on what to do when an activist comes for you. Oh, man. And this one, not just one, but 5 activists have come for them. Do you think that Benioff is a little too sanguine here, given the pressure that is seemingly on him?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Appreciate it this morning. He said all of the probably best things you could say when you're dealing with an activist, let alone multiple, right? So when he says various levels of understanding, that is also a nod to they may not really fully understand this business. So if we're in a proxy fight later, shareholders, please consider that. I have a beginner's mind when I'm dealing with them. Again, they don't have the granular level of detail of understanding that I may have, but I take that in stride whenever I'm having conversations, right? So these are things that, when you're in the space and you kind of can understand probably what's being told to him by his advisors when they're guiding him before having these sorts of conversations, you can tell how they're sort of starting to frame the narrative of potential campaign going forward. So although he seems upbeat, it's also clear that he's staying on message and is probably paying very close attention to what his advisors are telling him with respect to a potential campaign that may come down the pipeline in a few months. As you probably heard, there's been rumors that Elliott submitted nominations yesterday, probably trying to step on earnings yesterday morning before earnings came out. So he may be in a fight and he's staying on message.
One thing that we've continued to make note of over the course of this earnings season is the big companies that have had this activist pressure. Salesforce, just one of them. We already had seen what Disney had to do to try and dampen some of the noise that the activists were really pressuring the company on. And so on many different factors in both of those cases there, are the activists winning this particular campaign era that we're seeing across a couple of sectors?
Well, we'll see, right? We are not quite an annual meeting season yet, and we haven't seen a high volume of settlements come out yet. But in Disney's case, obviously the activists didn't do too great there. So if that's a canary in the coal mine, maybe it won't be a strong season for activist victories. But that being said, Salesforce is very different, and they're also dealing with a very different type of activist. So when you're dealing with like an Elliott Manning, right, an activist with a great deal of experience, an enormous battleship type of balance sheet, who is not afraid to run campaigns and spend umpteen millions of dollars, it's different than, say, a marginal activist that you may encounter as maybe a mid-cap type company, right? So with the larger companies, I think the swarm, the wolf packing phenomenon, that's a little new. Usually these guys try to stay in their own streams. If they're rowing, to keep their eyes in the boat. But, lately we've seen activists have no problem sort of stepping on each other's toes, bullying their way in, even if there has already been announced activist constructive engagement with a separate activist. And that actually is new. They tend to play very well with each other and not so great all the time with management. So it's interesting seeing them kind of have friction and rub against each other in these campaigns.
Yeah, it has been really interesting. I want to zero in on Elliott just a little more for a minute, Patrick, because we did get a statement from them. They're encouraged, on the one hand, by what's going on. The set of announcements they said in their statement today represents progress towards regaining investor trust. These steps are consistent with our recommendations. We believe they'll help restore value at Salesforce. At the same time, they said they still want to see a new board, and they still want to see basically a succession plan for the company. Of all the activists, why is Elliott so fearsome in particular?
Well, Elliott is different in that their willingness to spend on any campaign is probably higher, right? So, you're speaking about a company or a fund, that has no problem spending $15 million, $20 million to win a campaign. That is really unusual, right? Because, that is capital that you otherwise could invest, and they're spending it on proxy advisors and lawyers and other advisors to win a campaign. And the other thing about Elliott is Elliott has a long track record of not being intimidated by anyone or anything, including sovereign nations, right? So when you are willing and able to sort of, shake the knees of Argentina, I think that you probably aren't that concerned or intimidated by Salesforce or Marc Benioff, right? And so, it was very interesting to see some of the talking points that came out of yesterday's earnings from Salesforce. A lot of them had to do with many of the criticisms and the focus points of Elliott, succession being one of them. After Brett Taylor's departure last year, after his short time as co-CEO with Marc, I'm sure there were already rumblings at that time. So there's been a little runway since then without any announcements, but at least a nod to the concern. I think that was really important coming out of yesterday's earnings from the company. But obviously, Elliott isn't going away. And I think for them, progress means, look, we are a long-term shareholder from our perspective. We want to make sure that yesterday was a catalyst for sustainable change and sustainable progress, as opposed to sort of an aberration, right? And a one-off event that isn't necessarily an indication of what the future may hold. So we'll be here. We stepped on your earnings yesterday with our leak of our submitting nominations, and we may very well see you at the annual meeting if you don't find a way to constructively reach a settlement with us that we feel like is reasonable and in the best interest of all shareholders, but primarily Elliott.
Patrick.
Right? I think that's all interesting.
Undoubtedly, over the years, you've seen the share price movements, the stock movements on any of the activist campaigns once they're announced, once there are filings of positions being amassed or requests that have been made as well. But for investors who are trying to figure out, all right, sure, yeah, these names are in there and playing right now and trying to make their voices heard to management. But what about when they retreat? What happens then, and how should investors go about that frame of mind, and what are some of the kind of keys that they should be looking out for to know when an activist campaign is starting to subside?
Sure. So really great question. It's really important for investors when they are dealing with a potential activist in a portfolio company of their own to think about what is this particular activist's average holding period, right, after a campaign. Are they into stocks for 2 years, 3 years, or are they in positions for 6 years after a particular campaign? That is activist sensitive, right? Each activist has its own sort of average period that it will hang around the hoop after it has board seats or after it has catalyzed change. So it's more about who you're dealing with and how long that activist is willing to constructively work with management before they move on. But it's important to remember, look, these activists, they deploy capital, they do their thing, they move on. It's not that different from M&A ARB funds in terms of, if you look at the correlation of their returns and how they actually map out with other special situations type funds. So it is a concern for shareholders. And I do understand, because I've had many conversations with boards about, look, how long are these guys going to be here if they're nominating all these different dissident candidates? And then, 6-8 months from now, they take off. That's not great for us long term. But when you're dealing with Elliott does have a history of actually staying invested in companies that it does target for activism for long durations of time, right? Years and years and years. And after they feel like, the company's stock price has met its intrinsic value or a premium to that intrinsic value that Elliott has estimated internally, then they may sort of, shave some ownership out of their position. But in all intents and purposes, they'll actually be hanging out.
Really good insights and analysis of this situation with Salesforce and, of course, the historical context as well. We appreciate the time. That's Patrick Gadson, who is the Vinson & Elkins partner and co-chair of Shareholder Activism. We appreciate the time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.